I'm speaking with Jeff Bond, author of The World of The Orville. Thank you for speaking with me.
It's my pleasure.
So first, tell me, how did you get into writing a book like this? How did you get into the subject?
Well, it actually was something that was assigned to me. I had written or worked on several books for Titan Publishing, one about the Planet of the Apes film series, and another one about art of the Star Trek films, the J.J. Abrams produced Star Trek films from, the 2009 version onward. Mm-hmm. And I just finished working on that. It's called Star Trek The Art of the Kelvin Timeline. I finished working on that, and Titan asked me if I'd be interested in working on a book about the Orville series. And this was something that I had just learned about and was, had been in production for several months and was about to go on the air. So when I actually started the project, they were filming their last few episodes. So I live in Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley, and I've in my capacity as a magazine writer and editor, I've been to visit the various studios around town a number of times. So I had been to 20th Century Fox before. That's where they shoot the Orville. Mm-hmm. So I was able to go there for a few days and talk to a lot of the people who were actually working on the production and take a look at the sets. And that was how I worked on the book.
So I assume that you've been a sci-fi or a fan, genre entertainment fan for a while?
Yes, probably since I was at least, I'd say as a kid, most of the, even the cartoons that I was watching when I was a kid, kids watched cartoons instead of playing video games. Mm-hmm. And most of the cartoons I was watching at the time were really kind of sci-fi oriented things. A lot of the Hanna-Barbera kind of action shows or things like Johnny Quest, were very science fiction oriented. And then I was watching things like Lost in Space and Star Trek. So I've watched these things for many years, and I was very interested in the Orville, when it was going to go on the air. I knew that Seth MacFarlane was a fan of Star Trek, mm-hmm. and I was pretty aware that there was going to be a kind of a element of something like doing Star Trek in terms of making the Orville. It's somewhat of a reflection on Star Trek, and I think when I was going over the original publicity materials and discussing the book, one of the things that some of the people who were working on the show were talking about was the fact that Star Trek had sort of been so pervasive for so many years that it had sort of become its own genre. Mm-hmm. So you could basically have a show with a lot of the elements that people would associate with Star Trek, like a starship and people in uniforms and with ranks, but that it wouldn't necessarily be Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that your program, I'm assuming, is not an official outgrowth of the show, that you do this as a fan. Right. There's obviously, I think, a certain amount of sensitivity to how this show is labeled. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing is it has, I think, a huge fan component of people who are fans of Star Trek and like the Orville because it is like Star Trek, and mm-hmm. They see it as a sort of an alternate version of things that they are looking for in a Star Trek program that maybe they're not getting out of new Star Trek. Mm-hmm. I think there's always going to be a relationship between Star Trek and the Orville. I don't know whether that's something that the people making the Orville necessarily want to be, something conscious and that's like always talked about in connection with the show, but it's certainly a connection.
Well, when I first heard about the Orville coming out, I thought Galaxy Quest, that was a show like that, sort of,
Yeah, that was brought up, in a lot of the discussions I had that, I think that's what people expected, and the people working on the show were not necessarily huge fans of Galaxy Quest, and that was specifically not what they wanted to do with the Orville. It's not really a satire or a takeoff of the genre, and I think that's what a lot of people expected. I think also people expected it to be an all-out comedy, and they did not expect that the plots would be taken seriously and that there would actually be drama on the show. So, I think the series, it took some time for people to figure out what it was. I think, fans of Star Trek and fans of science fiction were already kind of all in to watch it. They were going to watch it anyway, but I think it wound up bringing in a larger audience than that, because of the kind of unusual approach that it took.
Do you think, and since you bring that up, since fans weren't sure what they were getting, do you think the creators also were they finding their footing as they filmed each episode? Did they change the writing mid filming?
I'll tell you that I viewed the pilot episode, which was all that I was able to watch initially when I first got started on the book, and I sort of started writing based on what I'd seen from the pilot and what the tone was from the pilot. And one of the producers, after I kind of mentioned that during a phone call, he said, "Oh no, wait, you need to see the next few episodes." And I had been kind of unsure about how I felt about the show based on the pilot. And the pilot it's a very challenging thing. I think the pilot was the hardest thing that they had to do in terms of doing this series, was to set up this whole world and figure out what the tone was and how comedy was going to work, and where comedy was and wasn't going to be in the show. And I think with the pilot, you probably can see a little bit more work and exploration being done. And then by the time I watched the second episode, I felt like, okay, I get what they're doing, and this feels very right now, and I can see how they're balancing this. I think the characters, they had to sort of set up what every character was in the pilot, but they didn't really have time to explore them all, so you got a feeling for what they were. By the second episode, I feel like they were very confident, and all the actors, everybody kind of knew what they were playing and how to play everything. So I would say that, if there was any change in the writing, maybe it happened between the pilot and the first filmed episode. And any television series, you're always going to be feeling your way and making adjustments. So I'm sure that there was some evolution over the course of the first season, but I do feel like they were pretty firm out of the gate, within their first regular filmed episode of what they were doing, what the tone and approach of the show was going to be.
I'd say, personally, I found episode 3 to be the one where I thought, wow, they're being serious about this. They're really exploring, interesting subjects and, philosophy, it's sort of the philosophy, that's not the right word. They really wanted to look at, various sides of really interesting issues.
Yeah, that's, something that came up, in my discussions with some of the producers and writers and quotes. I did not get to talk to Seth MacFarlane. They were in the middle of doing the last few episodes, and I had a pretty good notion just from my experience in doing these projects that I probably was not going to get a chance to talk to Seth MacFarlane directly, just given the schedule. But I think that that's something that he said in interviews that he did with other people in the press at the time, was that they were trying to do stories that were, I want to say, the word is not analogy, but the types of stories that they used to do on Star Trek, and the Twilight Zone was another show that he specifically mentioned, where you're doing a show that is sort of, symbolizes something you want to talk about that you're not talking about directly. So it's kind of like a parable, where you kind of learn something or you get a new perspective on an issue by the time the story is done. And that kind of storytelling, I think, in a way, has sort of fallen out of favor, and it's harder to do with contemporary programming, where you have, for one thing, you don't have as many standalone episodes, and that's something that's unusual about the Orville, is that every episode is self-contained. There's a little bit of continuity, and there are characters who show up, from earlier episodes, but it's not, there's not like one story arc for the season. Each episode stands on its own, so you could conceivably watch them in any order, and you're going to get a standalone individual story out of every episode. That you don't see so much in television anymore, and specifically in science fiction, to do each episode that focuses around a different sort of topic or idea is unusual. So I think that one of the kind of ingenious things about the Orville is because it has these kind of visual callbacks to even sort of older Star Trek, maybe the original Star Trek or Star Trek of the 80s, where you have this super clean, very, very utopian, futuristic look. It allows you to address this kind of classic sort of storytelling that you might not be able to get away with, and people might not accept if you were watching a gritty looking show with a lot of shaky camera and overlapping dialogue and realism. There's something about this that sets it up as a fantasy, and I think you're able to do kind of more pure type of classical storytelling within that. And I think that was something intentional that they thought about in terms of creating the show.
Did you get an idea from any of the other recurring characters or actors that they were doing something different than what they expected?
I did. I was not able to talk to any of the actors. I was able to go onto the set, which was really thrilling and probably the most exciting part of doing the book. But they were actually, filming most of the time when I was working on the book. And I think that, I think all the characters or actors, did probably find it challenging initially, but these are all very experienced people, and I think they're all great at moving back and forth between drama and comedy. And I think all of them, for one thing, they're able to do kind of classic Star Trek acting when necessary. And the conceit of the show, I think, is to be able to shift back and forth between that and just how people would behave in real life. And that's what, I think that's what gives the show kind of a hook for a larger audience. I think, Star Trek, and I hate to keep bringing it up, but it's such a kind of a touchstone for this. But Star Trek has always had a kind of a strong, loyal audience, but there's a certain amount of a limitation on it because it's tough to relate to Star Trek's characters in some cases because they are very idealized and they're kind of perfected versions of people. And what the Orville does is allow you to really see yourself in these characters and how you might react in a situation. If you were on a spaceship, you're not going to be this rigid, perfectly perfect spoken human being at all points, and you're not going to be perfectly heroic at all points. And this show allows people to show, awkwardness and nervousness, fear, and panic and reactions that people would really have if they were in these kind of extreme situations. So I have to think that that's a blast for the actors, because everyone can kind of imagine, what would I really do, if there was an alien spaceship firing weapons at the ship that I was in. You probably wouldn't sit there and grit your teeth and just take orders. You might let out an obscenity or two or get upset. So it's a great, and I think all the actors are really good. And in particular, I really like Adrianne Palicki. I was one of the things in watching the pilot that I wasn't sure that I really liked was kind of the relationship between the Seth MacFarlane character and his ex-wife, and the idea of having his ex-wife on the bridge. And they sort of resolve it in the pilot and show you that she's going to be a character that you respect and who actually has a lot to teach the Seth MacFarlane character. But for the initial setup, it's really what you see is the fact that she has had an affair, and that the MacFarlane character is kind of bitter and angry about that, and he's very insulting. And you wonder if the show's just going to be Seth MacFarlane insulting this attractive woman in every episode. And I thought that could have really been disastrous. But they sort of, by the end of the pilot, you get the feeling that this, she's a very competent officer. And I really like the way that they wind up exploring that character. And she's the one thing that I love about Adrianne Palicki, she was going to play Wonder Woman in a pilot and it did not turn out so well. And I think a lot of people for a while kind of just knew her from that. And then she had a regular role for a season or two on Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And she played a really tough character who was a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, and she has a fantastic scene in that show where she's being tortured, literally like having her fingernails pulled off by a villain. And that's another kind of a weird situation to put a female character in, to have them being tortured, because it's very easy to show a woman as a victim. And she was able to play that so you didn't see her as a victim, and eventually she kind of turns the tables on the people who are torturing her, and fights them. And it's one of the most exciting things I've ever seen. I was literally like, and I'm jaded. I've been watching television my whole life, so it takes a lot to get me actually excited. And I was so worked up because she got across the fact that she's really suffering incredible pain, and by the end of it, you just are so on her side, and you want her to get back at these people. And so when they show her going after them, it's incredibly exciting. And she, this sounds like a huge diversion from what we're talking about, but she has a very similar scene in the Orville, and she's. I think she probably, I've never seen like a female actor do torture scenes so well and be so in control during them that you never feel like she's being victimized, and that that she's ultimately going to come out on top of the situation. So I think she's a powerful character, and she's also great at comedy, and she plays there's a scene in one of the episodes where she suspects that this woman that they've picked up might not be who she thinks she is, and she takes the security officer to, explore quarters, and she knocks on the door and says housekeeping, and that's just a perfect throwaway, one-liner. It's so funny, and it just kind of I thought showed off her attitude. And I love the actor who plays Bortus too. He's had, I think, some of the funniest lines and the funniest moments in the series. I just think it's an amazing cast. And Seth MacFarlane is, he pulls off being a convincing commander, and also being just a convincing regular guy, and he's a stand-in for the fans. I think that's and one of the things that I thought when I was going on this set, and I apologize, I'm very long-winded, and so if you ask me a question, I will give you a 10-minute answer. But when I was walking on the set, it's an amazing, it's one of the most amazing sets of this type I've ever seen, because they literally built the first 2 decks of the spaceship. And it's completely self-enclosed, so you walk around inside and see all these quarters and corridors and cafeteria, and then at the center there's a big spiral staircase you walk up, and you can walk out onto the bridge from there. But one of the last things I saw when I was looking at this is the captain's kind of suite in his bedroom, which is right under the bridge. And there's a little kind of staircase you walk up to get on the bridge. And the minute I saw that, I kind of it just sort of put the whole show in perspective as this kind of fantasy of that a fan, because if you look at the show from that perspective, it's like, what would it be like if I got to command my own spaceship? I'd have my gorgeous ex-wife or girlfriend be my first officer. I'd have my best friend be my helmsman, and have all sorts of crazy characters to interact with. I'd have romances with movie stars, and then I'd have the world's greatest apartment bedroom right underneath the bridge, so I can just walk up and get into it. So I think that Seth MacFarlane is believable, both as a guy who actually would be put in command of something like this, and as like a stand-in for any fan who wanted to imagine that they'd be put in that position.
Yeah, and actually, I see his character as sort of an anti-Kirk in a sense. He doesn't lack for confidence, but he has self-doubts, and I feel like he's been the one who's been seduced. He's not the Romeo or the
yes.
So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and the cast, I just love the cast, and I'm wondering, did they do anything special to develop the cast? Because it must have taken quite an effort to get, as you say, people who can do both dramedy and comedy. Sorry, drama, comedy, and action, to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my sense is that Seth MacFarlane, he's had a lot of experience in show business. He's made these super popular, kind of cult animated shows, and has been able to pull in a lot of celebrities who become fans of those shows to do voices for them, and then he's gotten to make live action movies. So I think he's able to draw from, both of those worlds, and kind of his experience and people that he liked working with. And he also is because he's a Star Trek fan, Penny Johnson, who plays the Doctor on the show, is a character on Deep Space Nine. And he's, had cast other Star Trek actors in cameos. He's used, Star Trek directors, and there's Brandon Braga and David Goodman, who are producers and writers on the show, are worked on Star Trek Next Generation and Enterprise, Deep Space Nine, and They have people, their cinematographer, worked on the Star Trek shows. So a lot of the people behind the camera I think are people that Seth MacFarlane was familiar with because he's a fan of Star Trek, and he wanted to bring that same kind of visual strength and the kind of clean futuristic look. He wanted the show to reflect that. So I think that his familiarity with all these people kind of behind and in front of the camera helped him bring all those people onto the show.
I love that he has Jonathan Frakes involved as well. That was I like seeing that.
Yeah, I did get to talk to him briefly, and I've met him before. He's a great guy, and all the people who used to work on Star Trek were very funny people.
Yeah.
And they got to always, Star Trek, even back to the original show, it has always kind of been famous for their outtakes and pranks and jokes that they used to pull, but those would not, for the most part, show up on screen. But humor was always a part of Star Trek that seemed like it was not able to get fully expressed because you can't kind of break the reality of Star Trek up to a certain point. So I think a lot of these people, enjoy working in the Orville because it allows them to do some of the things that they couldn't get away with when they were working on Star Trek. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the book a bit. So the blurb on the back says that you discuss concept art, there's on-set photography, technical schematics, production design, costumes, makeup, prosthetics, and visual effects. So how does the book balance all these elements? Do you have something you really focus on, or tell me about it?
Well, I got to talk to all the people kind of in charge of these different departments, and that I sat down, for a full day in one of their offices, and they just kind of had everyone come in and talk to me, and it was really educational and fun. And a lot of what I talked about these people, or talked to these people about, was their own, kind of background and the fact that they were all fans of this. So the book is, I think, balances. It's somewhat of a making of. And it's not, there's a little bit of a technical manual aspect to it because we show a lot of the props and the schematics, for the ship, and how they were developed and what they're supposed to do. I talked to, there's a woman there's a couple people who are really kind of science advisors and are in charge of kind of keeping the science consistent throughout the show. And so they were able to explain what different things did, and some of the scientific concepts they had for the show. I remember, one of the most interesting things I learned was that they talked about they had this kind of texture on the walls that you can see on the bridge and some of the other rooms in the ship. And they kind of theorized that this was sort of like a living, plant-like material that was constantly cleaning the air, and that if you looked at it, you'd be able to see these little kind of nanite tiny machines constantly grooming it or going through it and growing it. So they had strong kind of science concepts behind everything. So. We break down what the props and weapons and devices are supposed to do in the reality of the show, and then also look at the background of how they were designed and kind of how the evolution. The Orville itself went through lots and lots of design iterations, and some of the most famous kind of science fiction movie concept designers wound up working on different versions of the ship. I think Andrew Probert, who designed the Enterprise D and who worked on the refit Enterprise for Star Trek the Motion Picture, did some versions of it. Ryan Church did some. So you can sort of see all the different versions of what the Orville might have been. And I think the Orville wound up being this like kind of super organic shape. And I don't remember if anyone described it this way, but for me, looking at it, what's ingenious about it is it looks kind of like the basic body looks like a whale, and those kind of energy looping rings in the back are they went through a number of versions of those, and the basic shape I think was actually just sketched by Seth MacFarlane, that he wanted something that looked like this. But the way they have those three rings positioned, it's almost like the different positions of a whale's tail, in the process of swimming, as if it's like beating up and down. So it gives this impression that it's alive and it's in motion, even while it's just sitting there.
Now, since the show does sort of mimic, or the Union mimics sort of the Navy, with the ranks and stuff, they don't happen to have a Navy advisor on hand, do they? Or is that...
No, but they, I think between the kind of science people and the experience of a lot of the people who've worked on different Star Trek shows, they have their own sense of what the ranks are and departments. That stuff was all ironed out, and they sort of know what everything is supposed to be and where it's supposed to be. But it's always it's funny because one of the big differences between the original Star Trek and later Star Trek is that the original Star Trek was made by people who'd been in like World War II and the Korean War, and they actually had real military experience, and there's a little bit less of that in the later Star Trek shows. So they're somewhat less military dramas, but Star Trek itself sort of established its own reputation for how to do military drama in its early episodes. So there's always an echo of that, but I wouldn't say it's like hardcore, military. Not a hardcore military show. It's always like a paramilitary sort of thing.
So it's also interesting that, the original series Star Trek, it was a science ship, and yet they seem to do a lot of fighting and stuff. Whereas in the Orville, again, it's a science ship, but it feels more like a science ship. How the people act and the missions they go on and what goes on. So I find that interesting.
Yeah, again, I think that seems like a reflection of sort of what they were doing on Star Trek The Next Generation, that they wanted to get away from it being such a military mission. And that was even an argument on the original Star Trek. That I think they went back and forth, and so that was something that Gene Roddenberry evolved on. That he would tell you. I think he would tell you, 10 years or after he did the original Star Trek, that it wasn't military at all. But if you look at it and you look at his experience back then, there was a much stronger military feel, and he had done a whole show called The Lieutenant about people in the armed forces. So that was part of his experience, but he became much more of a pacifist as he got older. Of course, we're completely off of the Orville now, but again, I feel like that's the influence, and that they talked a lot about how they wanted it to be utopian and to get away from some of the problems that we have now and show that those had been solved. But they can have real conflict and interpersonal conflict on the Orville, and that's something that they've always struggled with on Star Trek, because Roddenberry's idea was that everyone had been perfected, that people had been perfected. I think that's one of the differences. Is the Orville? It is an optimistic view of people, but it definitely shows you that people can still have the same foibles and problems and that they're always going to have issues like that, and they're not going to be, people who exist without conflict.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask about the design you see in the Orville. It's kind of a bright show. There's, on the ship, it's, a lot of lights, and I wonder did you get the sense it makes it difficult for costuming and prosthetics? With a brighter set, you might see any flaws easier, or, how do they balance that, and what kind of budget do they have? Well,
they have the show is an expensive show, and if you just look at the sets, like I was talking about, it looks more. I was on the Deep Space Nine set, the Enterprise set, the Voyager set when those were being filmed. Mm-hmm. And the Orville sets are much more impressive. For one thing, there's a big difference in technology and how they're able to light those sets practically, so that the sets have built-in lighting. They still obviously use stage lighting too, but they are able to control. The lights can switch to red for like a red alert and light the whole set. And when you go onto the bridge, that the most amazing thing about the bridge is that forward view screen, which is like this wraparound. It's not 180 degrees, but it's almost 180 degrees. So it's filling a lot of your vision if you're standing on that bridge. Mm-hmm. And they have something like an 8K or 11K LED projector that wraps around that view screen, mm-hmm. and they're able to project stars and planets and, space storms and all kinds of visual effects onto that. They don't, and it's a tool for the actors. It's so the actors have an idea what they're reacting to. They are able to actually, it's very difficult to get an in-camera effect. So, 99% of the time on a show like this, if you're looking at a view screen, that is a composite. So it's two different pieces of film. Mm-hmm. And it's still the case that they do that if they're doing a complex special effect like a planet or something. But they have these in a library and can project them. And the stars actually are strong enough in terms of light that they can use that and actually film without doing a composite. If it's anything more complex, usually they're going to add it later. But the thing that I noticed that standing on the bridge is that it gives you such a feeling of reality. Like if they project like a planet that the ship's supposed to be orbiting around, I actually started to get dizzy because you feel like you are standing, hundreds and hundreds of miles over a real planet. Just because of the way it fills your frame of vision and how powerful the LED, light effect is. It is, I think a lot of things have changed about makeup, and, high definition television and is a big, issue for, makeup people in terms of how you blend prosthetics with skin. They kind of switched over, I think, from like brushes and sponges to like a lot of times using airbrushes to create like finer kind of painting blends, and that happened a number of years ago. But it's definitely more challenging, and I think they have to do thinner appliances, and they have to do things that are going to hold up on a high definition television, and it's more like what you would have to do for a movie now, because everyone, most people have a giant big screen television that's showing everything in high definition, and they can get a really good look at makeup effects like that. But it is more challenging, and one of the things that they discussed, some of the early designs of the Orville and even the concept of the show was that going to be something more like a tramp steamer or something like Alien, where you might just have a small crew, and the ship would be smaller, and it would be like a darker grittier look. And, Seth MacFarlane said that he didn't want to do that. He wanted it to be a big ship. He didn't want it to be, people to feel like, oh, these are, this is a comedy crew and they're not as good at their jobs. And so this is the only kind of ship they could get. He wanted you to feel like these people were all competent professionals and that they could maybe not command the greatest ship in the fleet, because that you can see one of the things we have in the book and that I think they show at some point in the show is like a diagram of all the different class ships in the Union fleet. And the Orville is like a mid-sized ship. There's some that are smaller, and there are a number that are very, very large. And so, the idea is that Ed can't command the best ship in the fleet, but he can still command a good ship in the fleet.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how long Bortus's makeup takes to put on? Is it a tough process?
I'm sure. I don't know for sure, but anything like that, and it depends. There's a episode, where he's laying an egg, and it's a full body makeup. That something like that, I would assume is going to take at minimum 4 hours, if not longer, to put on. But on anything like this, normally, I would think that they would get it down to 2 or 3 hours, so you can shoot. But certainly any character like that is going to be in makeup for a large part of their morning, and have to come in way before anybody else.
Mm-hmm. Do they use the standard number of cameras, or is there anything different on set for the show that you noticed, maybe?
Well, like I said, the only real kind of technical difference was in the amount of control that they have over the lighting on the actual Orville ship set. That it's all rigged with, practical LED lights, and they control it like from a panel. And quickly, change their lighting scheme to be what they want it to be. But then you also have, Herman Rush, the cinematographer, who has great amount of experience doing previous space shows, and he's able to, get in with his own type of lighting for the specific situations. But, it's a one camera show that's the difference between like shooting a sitcom in front of a live audience is like a 2 or 3 camera show where you're running all those cameras to catch everything. I think for the most part you're usually using one camera. You might, if you're filming an action scene, you might have multiple cameras to pick up action or stunt work, but for the most part, this is filmed like any drama would be filmed.
So, what did you find that was most surprising when you were speaking to the production people?
That's a good question. I think that, I was initially probably the idea that this was not going to be Galaxy Quest, and that the people, on the show were not a fan of Galaxy Quest. But I just thought the degree to the amount of thought that they put into the show, I thought was fascinating, and that they wanted to take this world very seriously and create a real believable universe with its own rules, and then have comedy around the edges and be able to tell serious dramatic stories in addition to allowing more comedy than you would normally see in a space show.
Do you know how what the writing process was for the episodes? Do you know who Seth MacFarlane brought in to work with him?
Yeah, Brandon Braga from who was a producer and writer. I think starting on the 5th year of Star Trek Next Generation, and who was involved in all the subsequent Star Trek shows, is a producer and writer and director on this show. And David Goodman is a guy who had worked with Seth on some of his animated shows, and whose background is more comedy, but he's also a huge Star Trek fan, and he's written books on Star Trek. Mm-hmm. And he's another one of the key creative minds behind the show. Mm-hmm. And then they have a lot of writers, some of whom have worked with Seth MacFarlane on his animated shows, and some from other more serious backgrounds, but that they are all very serious science fiction fans. Okay. And so I think they all approach the show from that background first, and then kind of bring the comedy. I don't think any script for the show has been invented with the idea of, like, wouldn't it be funny if we did this? Mm-hmm. It's more like, here's an idea we want to explore, and then what how would people really behave, or what might be funny to come out of that. But they're going to approach the basic idea more seriously as a science fiction idea first.
Yeah, I've been impressed by the science fiction ideas they explored. So I just wondered if that was, from Seth's mind, or if he had other people who were helping.
Well, they have science advisors. Andre Bormanis is another producer on the show and writer, and he's started off as a science advisor on Star Trek, The Next Generation, and those shows, and he's the one that I would go to have explain how does this weapon work, how does the drive on the Orville work. So he's there to make the science on the show consistent, and to bring his own creative ideas to the show. That I would say, not to bring Star Trek into it again, but I wish that Star Trek Discovery had a science advisor on it. I assume that they don't, and that's been one frustrating thing about the show. And I'm not against the show. I like a lot of it. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of strange now that the science on the Orville, which is ostensibly a comedy show, I think is a little more thought out than what you get on Star Trek currently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree. I like both, but yeah, the Orville feels more, more of what I want out of Star Trek.
Yeah, I think I think that is a key to a lot of the Orville success, is that a lot of people, and I was seeing, before both shows went on the air, I was already seeing people say, "Oh, I'm going to like the Orville more than Discovery," because a lot of people didn't like the idea that Discovery was going to be maybe a darker show or more violent, and maybe not as bright and optimistic as the Star Trek that they were used to. Even though there's been, if you look at Deep Space Nine and or specific episodes of some of the other later shows, they all have their dark edges. But I think people wanted to see just a consistently more utopian, optimistic show. And Seth MacFarlane and the people behind the Orville were very smart about kind of sensing that was what people would be looking for at this period in time.
And definitely I see the Orville seems to really be reaching out to a younger audience. Like, what was it? Cupid's, I forget the exact title. That one, I was really pleasantly surprised at sort of the twists and turns it took. It wasn't afraid to go places.
Yeah, that's a great episode.
Yeah.
Cupid's Arrow, I think. There's some really fun stuff in that episode, and they can do, that's an episode that's more of an all-out comedy, although it still has some, serious moments and serious things to say. Mm-hmm. But they've got license, I think, to do everything from a, very broad comedy like that to something that's, more of an action episode or suspense or, more of a philosophical drama.
Yeah. I like how the alien races, they really look at, what would it really be like to interact with another species that just thought, behaved just very differently from humans, but for them it's matter of fact, and humans are just like, gobsmacked by what they see. So I think that stuff is cool too.
Yeah, that's always was a part of the best Star Trek, and just the best science fiction, looking at how, things can be viewed differently from a different perspective.
Did you get the impression, was there any thought of how many seasons they really hope to or expect to go with the Orville?
Well, they were talking about doing a second season, at least by the end of filming for the first season. I don't think that they had any idea how the show was going to be received, and it's funny because initially, it got very poor reviews for the most part, based on the pilot, and then wound up, doing very well in ratings because of football on Sunday nights, and they moved it to Thursday, and I think there was a sense that might be a disaster, and the ratings went down initially, but then they came right back, and they wound up having the same kind of ratings that they were getting, with the lead-in from Sunday football, which is really amazing. Mm-hmm. But I think they got announced fairly, not too far, maybe halfway through the season. They got a pickup, and it was, like I said, I think there was a little bit of uncertainty when they initially launched and during the move to Thursday, but for the most part, I think the show really outperformed what people thought it was going to do. So they definitely had some plans, and I'm going to be very interested in, because there's one character in particular that they had a plan for what they were going to do with them in season 2, and I'd love to see them actually do it. And I'm going to be looking forward to seeing if that happens. And I can't tell you what it is. So.
No, that's fine. When you were there, when you were talking to everyone and observing, did you think you were watching a show that would win the Saturn Award in its first season?
I didn't. I mean, it was very clear that a lot of money and a lot of care was being put into it, and that it was being, made by people who love the genre. I mean, Howard Berger, who does the makeup effects and creates the creatures for the show, is a huge, fan, and he did the show. He'd been working on The Walking Dead, which is a guaranteed job if there ever is one. But he did the Orville because he liked creating aliens and creatures and doing, exactly the kind of designs that he's doing on that show. So, I don't, I can't speak for the Saturn Awards or what the Saturn Awards do, but I had confidence that it was going to be a well-produced, and well-executed show. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, are there any last things you want to say about the book? I know we've gone all over the place.
I had a lot of fun writing it, and I'm a big fan of the show. I love the cover. It's my favorite book cover of any that I've done, because it's so clean. And there's a book by David Gerald about the original Star Trek called The World of Star Trek, and this book was originally going to be called, The Art and Making of the Orville, or The Art of the Orville. Mm-hmm. And I think Jason Clark, who's one of the producers on the show, who was kind of overseeing me working on the book, wasn't a huge fan of that title, and I had always wanted to call it The World of the Orville. because I wanted to do an homage to this David Gerald book. And when they said that they weren't sure about the title, I said, well, how about this? This is another idea I had. What do you think of this? And they like that. So it's probably the only time, in terms of working for another publisher, that I got to actually come up with a real title for the book. So that was kind of exciting for me. But yeah, I'm a big fan of the show. It was a huge honor to be able to do this book, and it is very challenging to write anything like this for anything that's in production, because there's a lot of eyes on it. I actually just sort of went through this on another Orville-related project, and it is very, very difficult. I was very lucky on the book because people care a lot when their show is in production. I do a lot of I work on soundtrack albums and a lot of things that deal with movie and television shows that are out of production, that have maybe are 10 or 20 or 30 years old, and those are much easier to do because either everyone's dead or they've all moved on and they don't really care so much about what you're doing. But it's very difficult to work on a project when it's in production, because there's a lot of eyes on it. And I got a lot of great support from the Orville people. They could not have been more helpful and supportive.
I was since you mentioned the art, I wanted to mention that usually with a TV show, when the credits roll, they have the intro piece. Usually, I see it once and then, okay, I don't need to see it again. But every time the Orville one runs, I wanted to watch the whole thing. Just, I'm a nerd for space images and spaceships. So.
Oh, you mean the credit sequence?
The credits, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's and that's unusual too, to have a full length credit sequence. Now credit sequences are like 5 seconds long. So that the show has great music and fantastic visual effects. I remember, I used to watch. I was the same way with Star Trek Voyager. It had this great theme by Jerry Goldsmith, and they had at the time it was probably the most beautifully designed main title sequence ever put on television. And I think that the Orville is very much like that. It's a lot of wonderful beauty shots of the ship and great music. So it's a pleasure to watch, and I do the same thing. I watch the credits at the beginning of every show. I should also mention I just want to mention that I'm very grateful to Titan Books for letting me work on these. I've done a lot of really fun projects with them, and they're almost all things that I would have written about on my own if I was just a fan. So it's great to be able to do that and get paid for it.
Oh yeah, I love seeing that this book is out. And I'll add, sorry, I keep mentioning new things. You mentioned the music. I really love the musical touch that I think it's Seth's touch. The sort of the music they add to the.
Yeah, Seth is. He's a musician and a singer. He's very interested in music, and he definitely is very hands-on. From everything that I've heard about, guiding the composers on the show to do what he wants them to do.
I love his work, but when I heard he's going to do sci-fi, I said, this will be interesting, and I feel like he's hitting it out of the park. So I really am impressed.
Another thing that kind of led to this show was him doing Cosmos and he did that with Brandon Braga. So that that was for the most part very serious, fact-based documentary type show, and that was a real labor of love for him, and that I think demonstrated at least his great love of science, and so you can see that kind of extending to the Orville, that he is a hardcore fan of science fiction and takes it very seriously.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to the second season and more, hopefully.
Me too. Yep.
So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, but it's a pleasure to talk about this. And as I explained at the beginning, I grew up on shows like this. I'm going to watch any show with a spaceship, but they're not always great. But Orville is always a very entertaining, fun show to watch.
All right. Well, thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to visit chrisalvarez.com or theartofsciencefiction.com for more great interviews, photos, and articles. Your visits help support this podcast. Please remember that my first name, Chris, does not have an H in it. One of the best ways to provide feedback for this podcast is to rate me on iTunes. Please give me a good rating if you liked it, or feel free to give me a bad rating if you didn't. I'll use that feedback to make this a better podcast. You can also follow me on Instagram under Chris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on Facebook under Chris Alvarez WLC, on YouTube under Chris Alvarez WLC, and on Twitter under Chris Alvarez WLC. Thanks for listening and keep imagining the future.